When the country locked down in March, millions of pupils across the UK had no option but to study at home. An exclusive poll for GMB by, I presume that's the Times Educational Supplement, a magazine for the teaching profession, has now revealed the impact of that. 93% of teachers say their pupils have fallen behind academically.
93%. Around the same number of teachers also say they lack faith in the government's policy for education during COVID. So with that in mind, should we cancel exams for next year to give pupils and teachers time to catch up? Well, we're joined now from South East London by Steve Chalk, who believes that sitting GCSEs and A-levels next summer will create yet another dimension of COVID inequality. In Putney, we have former Education Minister Justine Greening, who thinks we shouldn't scrap the exams, but we need a better plan from the government. And from Merton, Janice Janice, who says that we should delay exams till July or even into August, and maybe the exams should be scrapped for 2021. Let's start with you, Steve, because I know that you've been very open about this. You are certainly an advocate for making the decision early and making it now that we need to scrap these exams because the pupils, as we've seen from that survey, and the teachers feel like they've fallen behind so far.
Well, I think they have fallen behind. The disadvantage gap has become a gulf, as we all know. Survey after survey, research piece after research piece tells us that. The Institute for Fiscal Studies tell us that the funding just isn't there for the catch-up. And so I think you were saying earlier, Ben, that, have kids missed out too much? At what point would they have missed out too much? We have 52 schools. 17 of them have bubble lockdowns, partial lockdowns, or are closed altogether. We've got year 11s out, year 10s out. They've missed 6 months of education. Many of them haven't had access to the digital devices they need. And now, having been in school for a week, or some cases a few days, they're back out. So the only fair way forward, fair, equitable way forward for everyone is teacher assessment. But some teachers mark up and some teachers mark down. So it should be done on completed coursework for that school in that area. That shouldn't be set nationally because schools are doing different amounts of work in different ways. But what should happen is Ofqual and government should get their act together and set up a quality assurance process now with spot checks. We need a national framework so that teachers know how to assess. That's the only fair way forward. And as you pointed out, every child, every student, and this is for SATs as well as GCSEs, primary schools as well as GCSEs and A-levels, they deserve to know now. And the teachers need to know what to teach them.
Yeah, Justine Greening, you were Secretary of State for Education. Was the government right to close schools down back in March and leave so many students without access to formal education? I mean, one of the things I've noticed is the gap widening between the private schools, who seem to go pretty much, swiftly online, and the state sector, the majority of pupils in this country, where the resources were incredibly patchy. And as Steve Chalk says, there's a huge number of households you can't even get online. What should the government have done back in March to make sure that we're not in the situation that we're in now?
I think everybody understood that schools had to be closed. I think what was wrong was that there wasn't a plan to help children continue their education, and schools were literally left to their own devices to cope as best they could. As you've said, Susanna, we know that less privileged children and young people lost far more education than those, as you refer to, in private schools, who saw a lot of it move online and actually really things continued very much as normal. We can't make those mistakes again. As Steve says, quite rightly, we're now back in school, but education's still being disrupted. I think he's quite right to say that teachers need to know what's going to be happening with exams next year. I'm in a slightly different place to Steve in that I think exams should happen, but I do think we should recognise the shortcomings that we've got with them. They are basically memory tests too much. I think we should be looking at whether they should be delayed. We should be looking at whether the curriculum should be narrowed, whether there should be more reliance on coursework. As Steve says, if you do that, you have to have a way of making sure it's moderated and fair across the piece. But in a sense, you can't give up on levelling up through understanding attainment of children through school, but we do need to have a proper plan from government, not just for exams, but for how children catch up and for more broadly, how we have our exam and education system help level up Britain. We're about to hear from the Chancellor today on an economic plan for the winter, but that's the short term. In the long term, what's going to pay all these debts we're racking up is a high-skilled, high-salary, high-productivity economy, and that starts with education. And I think parents out there want to know a lot more from this government about what the plan is for their children's education, both catching up and also what's going to happen next year to make sure they don't miss out on even more study.
Janice Losey, you certainly feel like the exams should stay, but you would like to see them delayed to later in the summer. What is it that you think is so important about the sitting of the exams? Because, as Steve's suggesting, if we could just have teacher-led assessment within the school, rather than an algorithm that could, obviously, as we know, can have flaws, but if a teacher-led assessment where they know the pupils well, they know them clearly, what is it about the exam that you think is so important at the end of a year?
I think there's a few things, to be honest. First of all, I think us debating this now is really quite interesting because this is a debate we've had in schools, across different schools, throughout the summer term, talking about the fact that obviously we have to continue with the exams because we've got given no other guidance. We were consulted, and it's that sort of policy of consult and ignore, I think, which works quite well for the government. And from that, teachers then sat down and worked out, OK, how can we shoehorn what's left in the curriculum so that children can sit the exam? So we've got that situation already. Coming now at the end of the autumn term, trying to decide, OK, should we or shouldn't we, feels really late. So I think we should, in a sense, have a mixed mode, because children that I spoke to at the end of the GCSEs and A-level debacle were saying they wish they could have sat an exam, at least given it the best shot, because they know those last 3 to 4 months of any course, a lot of children, especially those from disadvantaged areas, really pushed the boat out and actually managed to achieve great results. But again, schools' hands were tied in terms of what assessments they could give. So I think children need the opportunity to actually sit an exam, but we do need to consider what should be examined and what should be teacher assessment. I think Steve's right in the fact that there should be a look at what do we need to assess, what could be the teacher assessment and what should be a terminal examination. And I think we need a mixed mode approach. But failing the discussions that we didn't have in the summer, we now need to think about, well, if we have to go ahead with this and we haven't got a mixed mode plan, and we clearly haven't, then we need to think about should the exam season go into July?
Justine, one positive is that the government is absolutely determined that schools and universities should stay open. I think we all acknowledge, and there is, evidence, that children's educations have been damaged, and that's potentially devastating for too many people. It's so important that they stay in school and university. Now, today, we have this suggestion from the Scientific Advisory Committee that university students should stay in their halls of residence over the Christmas period. Now, we're talking about university students whose A-levels were messed around with. They had all the anxiety of being able to get into university. What impact would it have if you then told those students who've only been away from home for a couple of months that you're staying in halls of residence over the Christmas period? Matt Hancock says he can't rule it out at this stage, even though he doesn't want to propose it.
It just seems like a really dramatic, draconian step when actually you'd think that with a bit of forward planning, you could potentially have a discussion with students about whether they want to do a 2-week quarantine of some sort or reduce their risk significantly through the steps they take that would mean they could then travel home and know they were doing that safely. And I think it's a good example of where a common sense discussion would probably help us avoid that kind of situation. I was hundreds of miles from my home at university. I went to Southampton, my home is in Rotherham. I didn't get a chance to go back much because it was so far away. And I think not being able to get back at Christmas would have been really bad. And I think for everybody, it's been a really tough year and families will want to get back together at Christmas. So I think that really has to be a last resort, absolutely, from my perspective.
All right, just finally, Steve Chalk, how do we help students recover from this particular interruption in their education?
Well, that's a brilliant question. And I think the answer is that we've got to get used to the fact that there will be remote learning right the way through this winter and this academic year for some children. Others won't have that. That's why we can't have a level playing field for exams. So what we have to do is equip them to be able to remotely learn. And what's happened thus far is the government's national scheme to supply devices, tablets or laptops to disadvantaged children hasn't worked. It's beginning to creep into action now, but it's too late, which is why, of course, setting the exams back by 4 weeks or 5 weeks or 6 weeks won't make any difference. The gulf is the gulf already.
And Janice, if you had one message for the government, what would it be?
Listen to the professionals. Teachers know exactly what they're talking about. They're well-experienced professionals. They know exactly what the solution should be. But if you're going to have another policy of consult and ignore, then we're not going to get a solution that we need.